Okay, I think we'll get started. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Kalum Palipana, Senior Lecturer in Architectural Design here at the Melbourne School of Design. And on behalf of the faculty, I want to welcome you all to this public lecture titled Talking Water, Take One by Professor Jane Wolff from the University of Toronto's John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we've gathered here today, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognize the importance of Indigenous knowledges in the academy. Argentine semiotician and decolonial scholar Walter Mignolo speaks to the situatedness of thought, writing, "I am where I think." That is, the position from which one speaks is imperative because the location has an integral relationship to thought. But what if we have less and less access to the words that detail our relationships to and with the natural and cultural landscapes around us, and we increasingly resort to flattened catch-all phrases like diversity and placemaking, and that obscure complex meaning and leave little room for nuanced debate and conversation. Not only are we at a loss for words, but it also changes how we see and engage with our environments and each other. As Robert Macfarlane writes in his book, Landmarks, to exercise a care of attention towards a place as towards a person is to achieve a sympathetic intimacy with it. And for thousands of years, First Nations peoples have been cultivating place-based situated knowledges until Terra Nullius was declared. And the stories and songlines and words untethered from communities and the land began to disappear. And so in Australia, we find ourselves trying to anchor perception again in its extensive lateral landscapes and immensity. In these conditions, we start to wonder, what role can designers and design scholars play? How can we retrieve and foreground these plural knowledges? In an international and emerging body of work, in which I would situate Jane's work, design scholars have offered novel ways to document and reveal new and generative insights into complex place-based social and ecological phenomena. This includes creative work that communicates in a way that appeals to broad audiences. Jane uses drawing, writing, and public conversation to decipher, represent, and consider the web of relationships, processes, and stories that shape everyday landscapes in the Anthropocene. A scholarly and creative work translate between rigorous specialized information and ordinary language to support discussion about complicated places among plural constituencies with a stake in the future. And with great pleasure, I invite Jane, Professor Jane Wolff. Thank you.
Important to keep time. I thank you so much. Thank you to Callum for this generous invitation to visit you and for your kind words, to Rosanna Verde for organizing my trip.
Could we have some more volume?
Ah, sure. Okay, how's that? Better?
I think so.
Yeah, it's time to be an opera singer. Okay, we'll try. So I'll begin again. Thank you, Callum, for your kind words and your generous invitation to visit. Thanks to Rosanna Verde for organizing my trip, to Philippa Knack and the exhibitions team for the installation of the work downstairs, to Jillian Wallace for your support of the visit, to the amazing students who joined yesterday's masterclass, to all of you for coming. I'm so thrilled to be part of a sustained conversation with you over the week, and hope that we can think about this evening as just one part of that larger time together, that larger discussion. And as a way of acknowledging the places and relationships that sustain us, I'd like to begin with the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, a practice of Indigenous knowledge that has been generously shared with the public by elders, including Frida Jacques from the Onondaga clan, mother of the Onondaga Nation, and Oran Lyons, Onondaga faith keeper. This version is based on a written Thanksgiving address offered by the Tyendinaga people of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Everyone listen well for a short time. I will give thanks to the Creator for the things that go about on the earth. We will make our minds one and give thanks to our mother, the earth. Now our minds are one. We will make our minds one and give thanks to the waters. We will make our minds one and give thanks to the fish, the bugs, the animals, the birds. Now our minds are one. We will make our minds one and give thanks for the roots, the medicines, the fruit, the trees. We will make our minds one and give thanks for the four winds, for our elder brother, the sun, for our grandmother, moon, for the stars. Now our minds are one. We will make our minds one and give thanks for our Creator for the good things we will continue to think peacefully about. Now I have done all that I can do. If there is anything I have forgotten, it's up to you to fix it. That is all. And I learned about this practice from the recent article, The Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, Moving Beyond the Havoc of Land Acknowledgements by Jennifer Wemigwans and Lana McKay. And I'd be happy to share it through Kellum if it's of interest. I think that in Canada and Australia, we find ourselves in different situations, but situations that have some resonance with respect to truth and reconciliation. I'd like to talk today about 3 projects that are conceived to instigate and engage public conversation about the climate emergency. 2 are done. 1 is in very early stages. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the process as well as the products, because that's been very much on my mind lately. The premise of all 3 projects is that landscape literacy is a political question. And that's because when people find it difficult to recognize and decipher their own roles in the ecosystem, their agency is limited. And I owe a great intellectual debt to Anne Spurn for her work on this subject, all the way from the Granite Garden to the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. I think the question of landscape literacy has been given new urgency by the climate emergency because its resolution, if there is one, is far beyond the usual scope of design practice. It's going to depend on the collective actions and decisions of great numbers of people. And that creates an opportunity for designers to articulate vocabulary to the complex, hybrid, plural circumstances of the places we belong to. That kind of vocabulary has to cross boundaries of expertise and interest. Plural audiences need to be able to mobilize it for plural ends. And I think what's most important is that, in my mind, the goal of this kind of work is not to propose a solution to a problem, which is how we're mostly trained as designers, at least in North America. It's not even to say in singular terms what the problem is. It's to frame public conversation about change. I'm so amazed when it works. Okay. So first I want to talk about a project that began almost 20 years ago, Bay Lexicon. I started working with the Exploratorium, an innovative science museum in San Francisco in 2007 with curators Susan Schwarzenberg and Pete Richards. And they were beginning to think about ideas for a gallery that would attend to the invisible dynamics of San Francisco Bay. The museum had not really dealt with environmental issues before. And 2 years later, I began work on the first incarnation of Bay Lexicon, which became the physical and conceptual centerpiece of Susan's new gallery, the Bay Observatory, opened in 2013, when the climate emergency still seemed to a lot of people like a phenomenon of the future. San Francisco Bay makes the image of of this city, but a lot of people love it more than they understand it. And I think the power of that scenery has obscured ecological complexity, natural and cultural dynamics, and ongoing evolution as a metropolitan centerpiece. But people don't always know, or they don't always remember, that the bay they know today and the cities around it have been shaped by military significance, by the ruthless extraction of natural resources, by real estate speculation, commerce, wrangling over environmental policy. And so the point of Bay lexicon was to consider the shore and its inhabitation as dynamic phenomena, to articulate and document a vocabulary that attended to ambiguities and complexities hidden in plain sight, to ask about the meanings and circumstances of the shore. And also, because of the museum's ambitions in the community, it had to transcend boundaries of interest and expertise, and it had to be able to be mobilized and reconstituted in the service of different aims. The ambition really was to offer terms different people could use to think about change in different ways. So the first incarnation was a series of flashcards that defined and asked questions about sites and phenomena and processes that a person might see on a walk along the shoreline. What were these places made of? What could they mean? How might they connect to a bigger picture? And the whole project began with an apparently simple question that I hope you can read in the banner in the picture: where is the edge of the bay? The flashcards lived in a cart. As a collection, they made up a field guide to this hybrid landscape of the bay shoreline. And the cards in the set, there are 48 of them, illustrate sites and circumstances where water meets land, and then asks a question about what that means and meditates on possible answers. So what you're seeing here is the installation outside on either side of the museum. I should say that the museum itself is right on the shore. So one side is at the water, one side is at the city, although most of the time the whole thing lives in the gallery. The second incarnation of the project is as a book, a field guide and a lexicon that talks about the shore's particularities and nuances. And here you're seeing two spreads. The field entries, which came from the flashcards, describe these places, and each one has a set of keywords. Don't know if you can see just on the abbreviated page that there are words in red below the text. And then each keyword is defined in the lexicon, and you're seeing a spread of the lexicon on the other side of this slide. And the lexicon consists of words we think we know, but it turns out that when they're defined in the context of a particular place, they're quite complicated and quite varied and quite specific. So, for instance, water and land, those are the two conditions that Western maps describe as homogeneous zones on either side of a line, the kind of fundamental definition of a shore on a map. But it turns out, just for starters, that the water in the bay isn't all the same. Most of it comes from the ocean, but some of it comes from rivers upstream. And salt and fresh water don't quite mix. The fresh water is less dense, and so it floats above the wedge of the sea. And all the water is moving all the time. It advances and retreats with the tide. The wedge goes inland in the dry season, seaward with the rain. The high tides spread it north and south from its route along the deep channel from the Golden Gate to the Carquinez Strait. It's carried by tides, by currents, by waves, by gravity and wind, and water has energy that takes sand and sediment with it. Land is also not all the same. The bedrock hills that European colonizers discovered on their arrival are still there, but there's also a tremendous amount of constructed land along the shore. And over the course of 50 years, a sloping, shallow, scalloped shoreline was replaced by land like this. There was a seawall built at low tide, just to above the level of the high tide, rubble fill placed on the land side of the wall, and a wharf to extend the surface of the ground above the water. And that ground isn't solid, it's porous, it's saturated to the level of the bay, turns to jello in an earthquake, but it's convincing enough for the construction of railroads, factories, warehouses. Its building enabled the making of the city. And then a century above after the construction of that horizontal surface, the unabated demand for real estate led to the construction of vertical land in the form of high rises whose foundations have to be very carefully engineered to manage the shaky conditions of the constructed ground they occupy. Also, what we're used to calling water is in a constant relationship to what we're used to calling land. So for instance, in the phenomenon of a longshore drift, sediment is carried forward by a wave and then dropped because of gravity. And as the process repeats, the sediment is carried along the coast and accumulates there. So when it meets an obstacle like this abandoned jetty that was built to anchor a southern crossing of the bay, the sediment falls and it starts to make new land. In this case, the embankment held the sediment, plants and animals emerged, a marsh formed. So the water changed the shape of the shore, it made new land. And not only that, what we understand as land gets defined by water. So the Rocky Islands in San Francisco Bay belong to the Coast Range, a chain of low mountains that form the San Francisco Peninsula and extend north and east across the bay. 10,000 years ago, the floor of the bay was dry and the rocks were hills, but then the last ice age ended. The glaciers melted, the bay filled up like a bathtub, and rising water made land into islands. And now the water is rising again, and the shore is in flux and will be in greater flux. So this project, which is now, depending on how you count, 11 years old, is still generating conversations in the museum, where Susan Schwarzenberg made the Bay Observatory Gallery into a platform for discussions of the climate emergency. And now, as the museum and the Port of San Francisco develop an educational partnership related to the port's climate adaptation plan, it's going to be part of the public toolkit. So it's funny, sometimes you begin work and you have no idea where it will end up or what its lifespan will be. One note about process and ambitions. This is a place I got to know well. It was a project that developed over many years. It was a project in which my work was to uncover and collect and represent information, to question that information in ways that could be widely shared. So in this instance, the project was to build a vocabulary and then use the vocabulary to launch a discussion. The second project I want to talk to you about has had a much shorter trajectory. It began just under 2 years ago with an invitation from the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of British Columbia to work together in ways that address landscape literacy and public engagement. Now, Vancouver is a place I didn't know well. I still don't know it well, but what I did have from 2 collaborations with the Toronto Biennial of Art and a long, long relationship with this curator, Susan Schwarzenberg, was a way of thinking about how to instigate conversations among people who did have knowledge. So this project, Conversations at Kitsilano, was an inverse process to Bay Lexicon, where thinking about a process of public conversation became a way to elicit vocabulary for change. Ron Kellett, the director of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, they call it SALA because it's faster, who was also the issuer of the invitation, suggested that we should organize our conversations around the pool at Kitsilano Beach. Now, this is a Vancouver icon. It's a destination for locals and for tourists. The place is famous for this wide sandy shoreline, a saltwater pool, which for us is a very unusual thing, and also views of downtown and the North Shore Mountains. But its singular beauty coexists, again, as in San Francisco, with layered meanings, contested histories, and complex ecological conditions. Why was it so interesting to Ron and became so interesting as a subject for our discussion? Because the storms of January 2022 had already shown that the pool's horizon was finite. What you're seeing here is
the pool in October 2022 when it had dried out, but then on the other side, it filled with king tides, and it was so undermined that it required extensive repairs. It was only open briefly in the summer of 2022. So given what seemed like the inevitability of change, we embarked on conversations in search of a vocabulary for looking ahead. And the ambition was to hear from people about what mattered most to them about this place, and what it has meant for them, and what it has meant to their sense of belonging. I think the real question was to try to find out from people what experiences and values should persist, no matter the evolving circumstances along the shore. Or differently said, as everything changes, what did people hope would always be true? So in order to do that, we made a time and place for conversation. There were 10 days at the shore, preceded by 9 months of preliminary discussions, explorations, preparations. And I wanted to say it is really important that this work was collaborative. It grew out of relationships with conversation partners who generously shared knowledge from many different points of view. It involved students and teachers at UBC School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. We were helped by a mix of Indigenous and settler knowledge keepers and experts from the beginning. And we had the generous contributions of citizens whose everyday connections to Kitts Pool and Beach gave them insight about its past and maybe also about its possibility. I just can't understand, I can't understate, I'm sorry, the importance of those relationships or my own sense of gratitude to the people who shared their thoughts and feelings in a place where I was a stranger. So what you're seeing here is excerpts from our timeline. I made a bunch of trips to Vancouver, and in between there was a lot of work with colleagues there by Zoom and by email. And the bottom bar shows a part of our 10-day installation and program series. But those 10 days would not have happened without the many cups of tea that preceded them. The installation was at the edge of the parking lot of the beach and the pool. It was a tent and a shipping container. So we unpacked everything every morning and we packed it up again and put it away every evening. And we were there every day, some combination of our 6 student interpreters and me. We talked to people who came by. We talked to everybody. We're just always talking. But we didn't talk about everything. We didn't want to talk about like the need for, let's say, more parking places or whatever. So to make sure that we focused on the pool and its future, my wonderful thought partner, Lorraine Wolff, who's a young landscape scholar, a member of the Tahltan Nation, and a lifelong habitué of the pool, she and I worked together to put together a handbook for kind of framing and instigating conversation. And our whole point was to be not institutional in style, to just be there on the sidewalk in a very different kind of setting from, say, the Science Museum of the Exploratorium, no bar to entry. And it's very interesting to know who walks up, what they ask, what they tell. We had a collection of tools for engaging and attending to the landscape. Some of them were off the shelf, like binoculars and measuring tapes. Some were designed by students in a joint seminar that Sarah Jacobs and I taught at UBC and U of T, and also in Chris McDonald's UBC Design Studio. We had projects by UBC alums. We had books, we had historic maps and photos. There were materials to write and draw. People could take the tools down to the water. They brought back treasures that they found. They left us notes and drawings. We had in the space of 10 days, 6 public programs led by people with special knowledge of this place. They ranged from walks and talks with Squamish and Musqueam elders to an intertidal conversation with a marine biologist to an evening of drawing as a way of what Zoe Todd calls attuning to place. We listened carefully to what people said. We kept notes in a logbook. And we also invited people to write and draw for themselves. And we read their contributions with care as a reservoir of knowledge about Kitts Pool and Kitts Beach and its significance, looking back right now and looking ahead. So this is a diagram of analysis. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the process of analysis that unfolded in the months after the installation, as my research assistants, Nick Aoki and Orly Saki, and our Vancouver colleagues, Emma Fennell and Zara Hirji, worked to document our experience. We were looking for connections and relationships among all those offerings. So we just made connections literally on a page of all those drawings and notes. We have a similar kind of analysis for the logbook entry that looked for words that came up a lot, ideas that came up a lot, notions that came through drawing, even if they didn't come through text. And then we had the good luck to be reunited with two people, Loren Wolff, whom I mentioned before, and Catherine Whitney, who'd both been really wonderful conversation partners while we were in Vancouver. And a conversation that we had with them brought us to a vocabulary for thinking about kits after the pool is gone. So we made a word cloud from all the words people had offered to us. And what you're seeing here is the word cloud and also a diagram that Orly made that helps to categorize the themes and also articulate the frequency which different themes, with which different themes come up. So that lexicon for kits can be represented in different ways, and it's really meant to be put into use. In a situation like this, we offered the vocabulary as a way to annotate a postcard from the future, a space where people can record their own commitments, their own values, their own hopes, their dreams, their fears. And like all postcards, it has a front and it has a back where we hope that people will write their own futures at the shore. And then in the meantime, as we were working, another king tide this winter brought even more significant transformation. The Canadian Broadcasting Company, CBC, reported in December of last year that the pool was leaking 30,000 liters of water an hour. I don't even know what that means, that volume, due to cracks and breaks in recirculation pipes. So you could say the future is now. We're not talking about a far horizon for change. Then a few weeks ago, the front page of the Globe and Mail newspaper reported that Vancouver's Parks Department had deemed the pool beyond repair. There was a huge public outcry, and I think it's because it's hard to imagine that the shore can have a future worth loving for people who've only known it with this particular character and this particular set of boundaries. And I think it can, I think it will, even without the pool, because it has in the past. Before colonization, when someone drew a line and said, this is inside, this is outside, this is the pool, that's the bay, the Kids Shore can change continuously with the waves, the tides, the seasons. That change supported life, and that change is coming back. So our report is actually on its way to the printers right now. And from there, it'll be distributed to all of our conversation partners and to the larger community. For people who belong to KITS, we're offering the report and the postcard in particular as a place to record their own commitments and dreams. For people who are farther afield, we're offering an account of a process and its products as a tool, an outline that people can use and transform as they pursue their own conversations about the landscapes they care for. The climate emergency is having different effects in different places. We're seeing that already. But what's ubiquitous is the need to think about what it means for the way we live. And that's, I think that's part of the reason I've gotten more and more interested in process and more interested in the documentation of process as something that can be usefully offered as a not as a template, but as a kind of, I don't know, maybe a place to get started. Now, the third project is called the Talking Water. It's really take one. It's in such early stages that I probably should not even say a thing about it, but I'm going to because it's really on my mind. It's a project about the place I call home, Toronto. And it's a different kind of projects from the ones in San Francisco and Vancouver, where water is everywhere. And it's where water is really part of the image of the city. I don't exactly know what this project is going to be, but I see that the questions that are arising from Toronto, from the place, and also the questions that are arising for me about my own ways of knowing are quite different from what they were almost 20 years ago or even almost 2 years ago. So I'll begin with a story about Torontonian life. We turn on our taps and water comes out. Where from? It runs away down the drain. Where to? Our roads are dry almost as soon as the rain stops. How? Some of the basements are always damp, and over years, in certain places, the stairs to front doors shift and tilt. What's happening? And as we walk the city grid, we suddenly find ourselves on streets that curve and meander. Why? What are we missing? We don't see the water until we do, until it soaks the basement or washes over the highway or floods the train station. And then we Torontonians feel shocked and surprised. We ask each other, where did it come from? Why now? And we don't understand that it was there all the time. Water in Toronto and in cities across Canada and across North America, it's a paradox. It's always there. It's we who don't recognize it because it's been hidden by the practices and processes of colonization. So what you're seeing is a photograph from July 8th, 2013, when I have to say seeing was believing. I mean, the streets were filled with pools and eddies. The stop by water on the train tracks, the commuters, passengers had to be rescued by police officers in dinghies. Children waded across the inundated Don Valley Parkway, which is a major north-south expressway in our city. I think it's fair to say that the water presented itself with a roar. And then over a couple of days, it receded into storm drains and out of our collective consciousness. And I think to myself, how did we get here? Yeah, how did we get here? How did we get to this paradox? I mean, I think this apparent absence of water in the city, for us, at least, is the consequence of historical colonial ideas about and practices about what water meant and about how people should live with it. That paradigm, which in where I live is still very real, treats water and land as a utility. So dump waste into it, for instance, or it's an inconvenience because it gets in the way of urbanization, doesn't respect the boundaries of property. So in Toronto, and I think in many other places in our country, those attitudes polluted streams, put them underground, and now we're left with a city that seems to be dry when it actually isn't. So what I think is really important to say is that apparent absence of water from the surface of the city becomes the cause of another kind of absence, an absence of awareness about water's ubiquity in the city and also in our lives. And that absence of awareness and understanding produces gaps that are practical, like when water asserts its presence in a flooded basement or a flooded highway. It's political, as in the struggle to build consensus around difficult policy changes. It's ethical, as in questions about right relationships to our city's waters and to all the landscape citizens and constituents sustained by those waters. And it's emotional, as in a sense of belonging and connectedness to this place that sustains us. And I think together those gaps really limit people's collective ability to talk about and work toward resilience in the face of the climate emergency. And the flood of 2013, the flood that produced this eddy, is a harbinger, because in our part of the world, far from the coast, on the Great Lakes, what the climate emergency means is not something like sea level rise. It means increasingly intense storms. So the rainfall over a few hours on July 8th, 2013, surpassed our previous record, the one created by Hurricane Hazel in 1954. And the colonial ways of relating to water that we've inherited aren't suitable or sustainable given what's coming, or for that matter, what's already here. So another thing to say is that as I wade into this new work, I made that pun on purpose, is I find myself questioning not only the structures of the city, but also the frameworks of knowledge within which I had been operating. I find myself reckoning with the absence of emotion and intuition and embodied knowledge from Western scholarship and from my own training as a designer. And I find myself realizing that those kinds of absences also represent a colonial condition, a condition whose boundaries my treaty obligations require me to move beyond. And that means engaging ways of knowing that include what's emotional, what's instinctual, what's embodied, and what's intellectual. Thank you. Okay, so this change in my thinking, I have to say, has been made possible by many, many, many cups of tea over a long time. And I want to say also that I owe that insight about the cups of tea, that turn of phrase, to my friend Jennifer Wimagwans. So many, many cups of tea with people who have helped me understand Toronto's waters from different points of view, from settler and indigenous epistemologies, all the way from, engineer at a water treatment plant to grandmother Jacques Lavallée sharing a story about ice and what it taught her ancestors. And I'm particularly grateful to my friends and colleagues, Jennifer Wimagwans from the Wikwemagong First Nation and James Bird from the Dene Nation, who've understood my purposes and really supported what I would call my change of mind. And I mean that in quite a literal way, that I find my mind is changing. The prehistory of this evolution is much too long for the scope of this talk, but it would be great to find time over the course of the week if people want to chat about it. So now I find myself thinking, what's a way of drawing that embodies plural and reciprocal relationships, that doesn't draw boundaries between land and water, or between roots and soil, or between people and the more than human? What's a structure for organizing information that portrays experience at its center, that is able to show plural scales simultaneously, that's organized around processes in which people are intrinsic, connected, and also responsible to other beings and to their place? And what you're seeing here is a note made very much on the fly, a drawing of the water cycle, which strangely enough seems never to have people in it. I've looked at so many drawings of the water cycle and there just aren't any people, but we know that there are people very much in the middle of that series of transformations. So, water is a cycle. It's a constant presence that changes state and changes place without a beginning, without an end. It travels through soil into plants and animals and people. It collects in the rivers that we draw erroneously as lines. It goes from the river to the lake, from the lake to the clouds. And I think that understanding water and making water present in our own minds means registering its passage through all the landscape's constituents. I find myself asking things like, how much water is held in the tree canopy? How much water is in the body of the city citizens at any given moment? And oh my gosh, I think good. All right. So this way of wondering is suggesting to me a new set of keywords very different from the keywords of Bay lexicon, which are things like infrastructure and commerce and work and defense. It's a vocabulary that comes from feeling and experience as well as from thought and observation. It's a kind of lexicon I think I'm working toward, in which water becomes a way to find certainty, foresight, memory, joy, logic, light, compassion. Something I would not have imagined when I undertook work on that other lexicon. I find myself wondering also what happens to drawings when they're reimagined through this kind of vocabulary, a vocabulary of experience and emotion as well as intellect. What are the possibilities for representation and discourse when the lexicon comes from a different way of understanding what knowledge is? When it's enriched by insights from family, from friends, from treaty partners, and how is it possible to share those ideas so that a person who walks over a catch basin cover is able to hear the creek that's trapped in that storm drain and to feel not only an intellectual concern about what that means for the environment, but to feel also an instinctual and emotional, physical sense of gratitude, of sorrow, of connection, of responsibility, of agency. This is not a picture from the storm of 2013. This is a picture from last month, the 16th of July. We had 98 millimeters of rain in 3 hours. The basements flooded, the expressway flooded, the train station flooded. We had another 100-year storm 10 years later, 11 years later, actually, almost to the day. And what that means, I think for us in Toronto, we really have to rethink our collective relationship to water. We have to make it a presence instead of an absence. And that's a big paradigm shift, one that is going to ask us to think differently about our connection to the place we live, and one that I think is closely tied to the work of truth and reconciliation. So talking water has two meanings. One suggests that we Torontonians talk to each other about the water we live with. And the other recognizes that the water is talking to us. And in that recognition, it asks for a process of listening with all our faculties, with all our ways of knowing. Now, these are very big words, and I do not know what they mean. Whoops. Oh. Right, okay. But I think maybe there's the beginning of an answer in a story. I'll tell you another story. Know it or not, every Torontonian lives in intimate relationship with Lake Ontario. Its waters flow through purification plants and supply lines to every tap in the city. They go into the body of every citizen and out again through sewer pipes and treatment plants, and then they return to the lake. Everyone who drinks from the lake is connected to each other, to the lake itself, to the creatures it sustains, and to the practices and policies that affect its future. I think that water is the key to our belonging, to the place where we live, and to the other beings, human and more than human, who also belong there. And in the recognition of that connection without beginning or end, there's a lesson and an invitation to live together in another way right now and going forward. It's a complicated time, and as I said, I really don't know what to do. But as Rebecca Solnit wrote in her beautiful book, Hope in the Dark, hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. I think with her words in mind, I have decided to commit myself that in the face of all this mess, we can still try to make a different world around water, whose presence, once we engage it, offers a means to learn and practice compassion for the places we live, the place I live, but I think probably also the place you live, and for each other. And that's the ambition of Talking Water, whatever shape it takes. Thank you so much for your time and attention for our time together. Oh, questions. Oh, I'd be delighted. Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone want to pose a question or a comment?
I haven't yet had time to formulate a question, but that was sheer delight.
You're so nice, even with the funky slide stuff. Still okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I do have one question. So you said you were asking questions from people with different cultural backgrounds about their understanding of water.
Yep.
So you also mentioned you asked many First Nation people as well as some people from more European background.
Yeah.
So what's the biggest differences you realized in between a European perspective versus an North American First Nation perspective towards water?
Thank you for asking that question. That's such a great question. You know, I wouldn't want to generalize in a way that flattened things, but I think what I hear is that my Western conversation partners tend to think about water as like something in the pitcher, you know? And they tend to think about it in a way that's kind of instrumental, kind of utilitarian, like, oh, we need water to take a shower, or we need water to irrigate the crops, or all the thousand things. And I think that even among people who are deeply concerned about resilience and sustainability, sometimes there's a kind of instrumental thinking that in our world presents itself in the language of ecosystem services, which, you know, values water and also treats it in a funny way as something that can be managed for a certain end. Does that make sense? And what I hear from my Indigenous conversation partners and what I read in the written work that I've had the great good fortune to encounter is a very different attitude that's about relationship. So that it's not like, you know, a person is here and the water is here, that we all exist in relation to each other. In North America, there's an expression, all our relations, that we need to do right by all our relations. And those relations include the water. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
It's like the question. It's really a great question. And I think it's very, you know, I think it's very complicated. I don't mean to suggest that a person of European background who is a citizen of not one but two colonial states, that I would ever have the knowledge that an Indigenous person has. I think what I've been trying to do is to recognize the limits of my own education and my own frame of reference, and to think, you know, how do I try to get beyond that? Because I feel that my responsibilities are not only to know and understand the treaties that apply to the place where I live, but also to really do my best to engage and understand the worldview of my treaty partners, the worldviews of my treaty partners, I should say.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. Yeah, so essentially from the European perspective, it's more like an engineering and utilitarian perspective. Water is more like thank you. And water is more like almost like a currency, like a money, or like
Yep.
like a resource.
Yep.
But from the North American First Nation perspective, it's more like the larger picture, the relationship, the interconnect activity.
Yeah.
Like we are all a part of a larger picture.
Yep, you are spot on. And in fact, the word you're making me think of is commodity. That in Canadian culture, in American culture as well, in North American culture, I'll just say, both land and water have an entrenched status as commodities. They are not thought of as relations. They're not thought of as relations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe just on a question to expand on what he asked you is, I got the concept of indigenous epistemology.
Yeah.
So I hope I got it right. That's okay. Wondering if you have the opportunity of, when you engage with those indigenous community, did you have the opportunity to maybe get a concept or word that could actually help you to explain part of the landscape, but not in an English or not like a more conventional way, but using indigenous terminology probably?
You know, I'll tell you a story. It's not, I think it's not too far outside the boundaries of what's suitable to say. I was thinking about the absence of water, and then suddenly, in a very short period of time, there were many other kinds of absences in my life. And I kept thinking, what is this? What is this? Like, I know it's connected, but I didn't know how. And my dear friend Jennifer Wemigwans, I was like swirling in my mind, and I said to her, Jennifer, I'm crazy. And she said, you're not crazy. What you're talking about is the kind of understanding that we in her First Nation and in the Anishinaabe peoples generally, it's the kind of understanding that we describe in the medicine wheel, which has 4 quadrants, 4 ways of knowing, with the mind, with the spirit, with the heart, and with the body. And, it was so interesting because when she said that to me, suddenly, all this stuff that had seemed so confusing, I don't know, it's like it suddenly didn't seem confusing anymore. I thought, oh, right, I'm a person. I'm not only, like however many grams of gray matter is up there. So I can't say exactly that I understand specific terminology, but that framework about ways of knowing has been very helpful to me. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. But maybe just one, sorry, yes. Maybe it's just on that, because it's usually sometimes we kind of engage with First Nations, and sometimes the answer is just there, but we try to kind of bring that concept to a more conventional way of communication, I guess. And sometimes we lose that meaning from First Nation. And yeah, maybe that would be something that would be interesting to look into, if it's, like if there's a concept that First Nation has actually in their culture, maybe just bring it to the landscape, I guess.
I think you're raising a really huge question about our discipline, and about who, at least in Canada, about who is in our discipline. There are hardly any Indigenous landscape architects in Canada. I can't think of 5. Okay, so I think for me, the thing that has been more and more urgent is to make sure that when I start thinking about something, that I have a thought partner who's Indigenous. And maybe that person is a landscape architect, like my wonderful friend and colleague, Lorraine Wolff, who is just beginning a PhD in landscape architecture at Berkeley, or my friend Jennifer, who is not a landscape architect, or there are a few other people who've been very generous and kind. Also, my friend James Bird, my friend Ange Loft. I just and I guess the other thing I should say is that I haven't worked in ways that are inside a particular hierarchy or power structure. I've just kind of said to people, could we have tea? And people have kindly said yes. And through those relationships, I guess I've started to understand things in a way that I think prepared me for what I had been reading and sort of getting and sort of not getting. So I think for me, the question is less about how a person with a Western background can translate indigenous knowledge. For me, that would not be, I would not feel that I could do that. The question for me is how to always be in conversation with someone who comes from that world, and to really know that person as an equal partner in inquiry. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
It's tough. I mean, I don't know what it's like here. I think in Canada, we are struggling, and yeah, we're struggling. And I think we just have to keep trying. Yep. Hi.
I have a question. Thank you for the talk. I really liked the bit about the conversations with the shipping container and the tent.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you approach and seek the perspectives of people who don't engage actively, even if the barriers to entry are low, or who don't put the same value on the work that you do.
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, like the people who just walked past, I mean, we didn't try to like catch anybody with a butterfly net, you know what I mean? But we did have these funny experiences, like especially at the beginning, when we were first there, people would come up to us and they would say, "What are you selling?" And then we'd say, "Well, actually, we're not selling anything, but we're giving some stuff away. Would you like some, or would you like to, chat, or would you like to draw, or would you like to whatever?" And some people just said no, and that's okay. And some people said, "Well, that's kind of strange," but then they came back. I mean, that was a really interesting thing to me, that over 10 days, we started to build a little, collection of interlocutors. And so I don't know. I'm a person without a lot of power. I mean, I'm just me, right? You can see I can't even figure out how to work the slides. And I don't think that there's all that much to be gained from like trying to make somebody engage. But I do think that if you just show up, if you just sit there, if you say hi enough times, sometimes people change their minds about whether it's too weird or whether it might be something that's interesting to them. I mean, I think, what's that line, that showing up is 80% of the job? I think it's really true. Just to kind of be there and be open to possibility, I think goes a long way. That's been my experience in my data set of one. Yeah. Thanks, that's a great question.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to build on that question. So my work is kind of similar. I use drawing practices to kind of understand the connections people have with each other and with the river in Indonesia and Malaysia. And often when I go to site and I kind of use my drawings to, start a conversation and learn about their values, like the way that you did in the container kind of project, which was really nice. But what I realized that like what I want to talk about sometimes is like very different than what they would like to talk about. I just want to ask like, "Oh, what do you do here? Like, give me some information," instead people is just like, "Oh, where are you staying? What are you going to have for dinner?"
Yeah.
And you kind of mentioned that you use like a kind of like a template. I just wanted to hear a bit more about like, was Was that the reason that you decided to use a template, or were there any instances where you just didn't use but got something out of it as well? I don't know, maybe just
Yeah.
a bit of insight on the maybe challenges.
Such a great question. It's such a great question. And I think you're exactly on it. Like, if you're going to just say to people what's on your mind, the range of possibility for answers is very, very wide and not always terribly helpful. So what happened to us was on the first day, there we were, and this, is it okay if I tell you another story? Is that okay? So this man came up and he was on, I'm not kidding you, for half an hour about the parking spaces. Like, we couldn't get him to stop. And, you know, finally he had to be somewhere and he left. And so then we thought, this is not going to be helpful to our ambitions. And so with Lorraine and I sat down and we thought, okay, like, and she really knew a lot about this work. I was really grateful for her, for all of her insights. I thought, what are ways to get people to talk about their experience in a place? Like, if you come to the beach for a day, who comes with you? Where do you like to sit? What do you bring for lunch? You know, what's your favorite memory of this place? Questions that don't tell people what to tell you, but in a way help them to connect to things that really are about the place. And people told us amazing stuff. You know, the thing about Kids Pool, it's a seawall and then it's fed by the bay, but it doesn't have an edge on the landward side. It slopes really gently. And I remember this woman told me the most beautiful story. I said, what's your favorite memory of this place? And she said, you know, when my son was really small, a toddler, I brought him here. And because he could just walk into the water little by little, he wasn't afraid to swim. And that's so powerful, not only because it spoke to her connection about that place, but because her memory of the past is also an idea about the future. You could make that condition even if the water is much, much higher. You don't have to have a pool to make that condition. You just need a shallow slope and something to break the waves. So I think that's really interesting when people tell you what they love or what they like to do. What's your favorite thing? You know, I think there are a lot of really powerful ideas about what in our world we call program, you know, that can be pulled apart from the forms that people get so attached to, you know. And I think, you know, when there was this piece in the Globe and Mail about the public outcry, don't close the pool, and, you know, the pool is gone. The pool is yesterday. I think it's because for so many of us, I include myself, it's sometimes hard to say goodbye to the shape, you know? And if we can remember that the shape, like, the shape is just a container for the thing that really has meaning, you know, the experience that really has meaning. So I don't know if I answered your question either. Yeah. Yeah.
We might have to continue the conversation upstairs. I'll just go in. Thank you. So thank you, Jane.
Thank you,
so
Callum.
much
Thank you.
for that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming along tonight. And if you can stay a little longer, we can, Jane will introduce the exhibition upstairs in the atrium, which is on level 1 of this building. And the exhibition is titled Conversations Along the Shore. And you have the summer refreshments there and also more opportunity to chat to Jane. So thanks so much. Thank you.